Let's review what we have done so far. When this page loads, our items slide from the left side of the screen. Let's have one more look. Okay. And when we click on an item, that item slides to the left of the screen. That works perfectly fine. But what if we want a more customized kind of animation? For example, when the page loads, instead of a slide in effect, I want a fade in effect. I want my items to fade in. And when I click on an item, I want its background to turn to red, and then I want to see the slide out effect. So let's see how we can implement this. Back to our animations module, we defined this reusable trigger called slide. Now look at the implementation of the leave transition. This is our slide out effect with some kind of bouncing. Now here, I don't want to apply a red background because it only makes sense in the context of to-do items. I want this to be reusable so I can use it in multiple places. Also, I don't want to change this enter transition to implement a fade-in effect because again, I want this to be reusable. So what we need here is a custom trigger for to-do items. So let's go to our template. Here I'm going to change slide to something custom, like to-do animation. And that means we should go to our component. Here in the animations property, we need to define a custom trigger. So trigger, we call this to-do animation. And here's the implementation. Now we need to import all these animation functions from Angular/animations module. To save time, I'm going to go back to our animations module. On the top, I'm going to copy this line into our component. Better. Now let's implement this trigger. We want two transitions. One, when the element enters the view, and the other when it leaves the view. Okay. Now, when it enters the view, I want a fade-in animation. But we already defined this in our animations module. Let's have a look. So, right here, look, we've got a fade trigger. And this is the problem. Here we have an entire trigger, and we cannot use a trigger inside a transition. So temporarily, I'm going to duplicate this code, but in a slightly different way in our component, and then we'll come back and refactor this. Okay, so back to our component, I want to implement a fade-in effect from scratch. So first, we need to change the opacity of this element to 0. So style, we set the opacity to 0, and then we want to change it to 1 over a period of time. So for that, we're going to use the animate function. Animate, let's say 2000 milliseconds. And we don't need to set the style here again because Angular is smart enough to know that it needs to change the opacity to 1. Beautiful. Now, what about the leave transition? Let's go back to our animations module. So, in the last lecture, we implemented this bounce out left animation. This is fairly complicated. We have a couple of keyframes with a lot of details. We don't want to duplicate this in so many places. So, let me show you how to extract this code, put it somewhere else, and then reuse it in multiple places. First, I'm going to cut this code, the entire animate function. Okay, cut. So now the body of this transition is empty. Now, let's scroll up. Here I'm going to define another variable called bounce out left animation. Note the naming convention here. I added the word animation as a suffix, and this is my own convention and something I highly recommend you to do, and you will see why in a second. So now let's set this. Here I'm going to call another function called animation. This function is also one of the helper functions in Angular/animations. Now for some reason, my auto import plugin doesn't like adding this function. I don't know what's going on here. So let's just add it here. Animation. Now, as the argument to this function, I'm going to paste the code that I just cut. That is the call to our animate function. let me quickly reformat the code. So this is the end result. Now this may look a little bit confusing, and I personally believe it's because of the naming of these functions in Angular/animations module. It would be better to call this create animation as opposed to animation, because animation is very similar to animate. Now to recap here, we use the animate function to apply a bunch of styles over a period of time. We're animating an element, right? On the other side, we use the animation function to create a reusable animation, okay? Now, back to our slide trigger. Here in the transition, in the leaf transition, we simply call use animation, which is another helper function, and then we give it the name of our animation, that is bounce out left animation. Now to make this code even cleaner, we can get rid of these square brackets, because we use these square brackets to define all the steps during a transition. Now here we have one step, which is using a predefined animation. So let's remove this and make the code cleaner. So now that we have a reusable animation, we can go back to our to-dos component. And here in the leaf transition, we can reuse that. Use animation, bounce out left animation. And also here we can apply that red background I was telling you about. So when this element is about to leave the screen, I want to change its background immediately. So style, background, color to red. Then I'm going to apply animate, let's say 1000 milliseconds. So over 1 second, the previous style, which is the red background, will be undone. And then our bounce out left animation will kick in. Now, let's take a look at the result. Back in the browser, refresh. So our elements are fading in, beautiful. Now let's click on one of them. Perfect. That's the kind of custom animation I wanted on this page. So here's the lesson. If you have a complex animation with multiple steps and you want to reuse this in multiple places in your application, you can call the animation function to create a reusable animation. And then you can reuse that animation by calling the use animation function. Now we are not finished yet. We still need to work on reusing the fade in animation. And that's what I'm going to show you in the next lecture.